Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, June 10th, and we will hear federal funding tools for TOD and other sustainable infrastructure. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel. I will do my best to help you through any tech issues that you might have. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the questions box. We will get to those at the end of the presentations during a designated Q&A. It would help me if with your question you put which one of the panelists you would like to answer it. That just helps me roll through our questions quicker so we can get through as many as we can. Coming up on your screen is a list of sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by a broad cross-divisional effort here. This series, which you'll hear about more in a moment, is put on by several divisions and I guess led in part by the Sustainable Communities Division. So thanks to all of the partners that band together to create this series. Let's see, there we go. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing and on demand. Also, this session does take care of your required special credit, the Sustainability and Resiliency credit, which is a 1 credit requirement. So this session also takes care of that. You can view this session through the end of the year and be able to record credits at any point. As I said, this is an on-demand session. So to log your credits, just head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number. Both of those can be found on our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes. I also post when we have new sessions available for you to register for, and I try to send messages out through Facebook letting you know of our upcoming Friday session. Just as a reminder, we record all of our sessions and we post them on our YouTube channel. So be sure to head over to YouTube and just search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. Along with our well over 400 recordings that are available free of charge for you to view. So be sure you head over there and subscribe to our channel so that you get notified when new sessions have been added. I normally add them the Monday after the session takes place. So this session will be available sometime on Monday up on our YouTube channel, along, like I said, with well over 400 other recordings. And always head over to ohioplanning.org to register for all of our upcoming sessions. We have a great summer lineup, including ethics, which will be coming down the line here shortly. So like I said, head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and you can register for all of our upcoming sessions free of charge. All of them are worth CM credit. And all of them are recorded and available on our YouTube channel. All right, so with that, I am going to turn it over to Carla Ebenbach, who is going to roughly go over the Sustainability and Resilience series and introduce today's topic. So Carla, it's all you.
Thank you, Christine. So welcome to the Sustainability and Resilience series. I'm Carla Ebenbach. I'm chair of the APA multi-divisional S&R series, as well as I'm a private planning consultant in Southeast Florida. And in this capacity and as Secretary Treasurer of the Sustainable Communities Division, I'm happy to present today's session. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the series overall and encourage you to keep attending and get involved. The Sustainability and Resilience series was created to provide learning opportunities for planning professionals to broaden and deepen their knowledge on these subjects with a range of topic options available, while allowing you to earn the new mandatory AICP Sustainability and Resilience CM credit or regular AICP credit if you've already fulfilled that requirement. The series and the development of the credit before it are based on these definitions shown on the screen for planning for sustainability and planning for resilience, as well as the 12 content topic areas that fall underneath. And you can earn the AICP credit for either live or on-demand version of any series session. And the recordings are, as Christine said, a permanent library of resources. They're available for free, thanks to the dedicated efforts of my fellow professionals who donate their time to making these events possible. And already available on demand to view on this platform or on the YouTube channel are 2 sessions we held last September on extreme weather trends, 2 from January on climate science and planning, 1 from February on the relationship of climate resilience and health through the lens of planning with Native American communities. And most recently, a session last month on 2 very useful technology tools for sustainability, NOAA's Digital Coast and Climate Central. Today's session will be available soon, as Christine said. If you have any colleagues who might enjoy watching it on demand, other sessions are in the work for later this year. We're actively looking for APA members to help organize sessions, to advise on the implementation of the series, to help promote it, to help connect with good speakers on various topics. So anyone interested in joining our planning committee, please reach out to me and I'll be very happy to talk to you more about it. As for future topics, upcoming sessions will get into such things as climate adaptation, climate mitigation, economic strategies, preparedness strategies, policy tools, and all sessions will endeavor to examine social equity implications within the presentation and raise the bar for how marginalized communities are embraced in the planning process. You can go on to the next slide now, Christine. So just to reiterate, you're about to participate in federal funding tools for sustainable infrastructure, including transit-oriented development, or TOD, as we say. Today's session will provide some useful information on 3 major sources of funding for sustainable infrastructure projects in your communities. And we'll learn more about the objectives and the mechanics of these programs, see how they've been successfully applied, and also have the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. There'll be a few polling questions coming up shortly to help the panelists get to know you better as well. Okay, next slide. We have 3 wonderful speakers lined up to tell us about these tools, who you'll meet shortly. And they include Megan Susman, who is a senior policy analyst in EPA's Office of Community Revitalization, Seema Thomas, who is Deputy Director for the Financial Management Division at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Robert Hanifin, who is Project Development Lead for Transit and Transit-Oriented Development Projects at the U.S. Department of Transportation's Build America Bureau. So thanks for attending today. I'm going to hand this back to Christine for the first polling question. Christine.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, folks, so I'm going to launch this first of 3 polling questions here. Let me just get to the things that I need to get to. Here we go. Okay, here we go. Let's get to these polling questions. All right, I have just launched it now. Here we go. So the question is, how involved are you in planning for infrastructure investment or implementing infrastructure projects? So your options are, I'm the lead for my department and community. I'm very involved, but not the lead. I'm somewhat involved, occasionally involved, or not involved. So I'll just give it a couple moments here. If you are on a mobile device, depending on how your mobile device handles pop-up type things, you may or may not have access to this poll. So if you're scrounging around trying to figure out where it is and you're on a mobile device, it's very possible that you just can't see it. Give it another second here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and share the results. Okay, so it looks like 29% is our largest percentage here of folks on the line who are very involved, but not the lead. And then 26% somewhat involved, 25% occasionally involved, 15% not involved, 4% I'm the lead. So to our panelists, that's who we have on the line. That's who we're working with today. Our second polling question of 3, I'm just launching now. What's the scale of your current transit-oriented development or sustainable infrastructure project? Is it incremental, substantial, transformative? Give you all a few minutes here. Give it another second. Okay, I'm going ahead and close it and I'll share the results. So 71% incremental is the scale of your current TOD or sustainable infrastructure project, 15% substantial, 14% transformative. All right, last polling question here, and then we'll move on to our first panelist. What is the level of capacity of your department to undertake a TOD or sustainable infrastructure project? High, moderate, low, non-existent, / may need to rely on another department. Another few seconds. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close it. Let's share our results here. So level of capacity of your department, 35% is low, 30% moderate, 27% non-existent, relying on another department, and 9% is high. So I'm gonna go ahead and hide those, and I am going to turn the presentation over to Megan, who will kick things off here. Beautiful, Megan, we see your screen.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today in this panel, and thank you to APA for inviting me. My name is Megan Susman. I'm with the EPA Office of Community Revitalization, and I'll be giving kind of a big picture overview of some strategies for planning for more sustainable infrastructure projects, and then I'll turn it over to Seema and Robert, and they'll talk in more detail about their programs. So my office, we're a bit of an anomaly in EPA. We don't do grants, we don't do regulations. We work with places that request our help to deal with development-related challenges that are really interconnected and can't be dealt with in a siloed way. And we use smart growth strategies to help them find these multi-benefit solutions. So just to make sure we're all on the same page here, when I say smart growth, that means compact places with a mix of uses that have a variety of housing and transportation options, and that involve everyone in the community in development decision making. So a good illustration is this intersection in Boise, Idaho, with a historic building and street trees. You can see people walking around, a bus, a bike, cars all sharing the street. So the way that we do this is 3 main ways: research and policy evaluation, which is how I spend my time mostly. We do direct technical assistance that usually goes to communities. We have worked with states and tribal nations and formal and informal groups of regional entities. And those are on planning, policy, and design topics. And then we also do a lot of convening and partnering, and that's within EPA. We work a lot with our Office of Environmental Justice, our Brownfields program, our regional offices. We work a lot with other federal agencies. I hope that some of you remember the HUD DOT EPA Partnership for Sustainable Communities that ran from 2009 to 2016. We've continued to work with HUD and DOT a lot since then. We also have other partnerships with USDA, FEMA, Department of Energy, and some other agencies. We work with these other levels of government, mostly through the technical assistance that I mentioned. And then we've also worked with the private sector on occasion and with non-governmental organizations. And the main way we do that is through the Smart Growth Network. That's a coalition of about 35 national organizations that represent a wide variety of interests, everybody from the National Association of Realtors to the Natural Resources Defense Council, and APA is a member of that as well. So where I spend most of my time and have been since, probably 2007, 2008, is on the intersection of smart growth and climate change. So I have been working with community design and development experts to help them figure out how to incorporate greenhouse gas reduction and climate change adaptation into their projects. And then I also work with climate change experts to educate them about how smart growth strategies can contribute to greenhouse gas reduction and climate adaptation. And of course, when you use smart growth strategies for climate change goals, you're also bringing all those other short and long-term benefits that smart growth brings to the environment, the economy, equity, health, and other community goals. So of course, transit-oriented development is smart growth just by its nature, because it's built around transit. Presumably that transit is accessible by walking and biking, and there's some density of users nearby to support the transit stop. Just by all of those features, it reduces greenhouse gas emissions compared to conventional development. But you can also design it to, with green infrastructure, to reduce stormwater runoff and flooding. That also helps ameliorate the heat island effect by lowering ambient air temperatures. So a good illustration here, you can see this. This is the Waterfront metro station in Washington, D.C. You can see there's a bike lane here. There's some planted areas, some fairly new street trees. The canopy over there is the entrance to the metro station. And then right across the street, there's a grocery store in the ground floor of that office building. So those are, relatively common, I think, techniques to use in TOD. I want to mention two others that I think are probably not as common and might actually be great topics for a future webinar. So one of them is, again, just because there's a lot of people around the central transit hub that can get to it without having to drive, it's a great place to have a resilience hub or a cooling center where people can come in an emergency, even if it's just to plug in their phone during a long-term power outage, or refrigerate medication, or just stay cool if they don't have or can't afford to run air conditioning. And those types of facilities usually are co-located with day-to-day civic uses like a senior center, a library, something like that. So it's also a great chance to bring in other services for the residents and workers in that area. You could have a job training center or a health clinic or something like that that could have facilities to be a resilience hub or a cooling center. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that, again, that density of users and the inherent energy efficiency of compact development, plus the mix of uses that smooths out energy demand throughout the day and night, that makes it a lot more attractive to do a renewable energy installation, which could be district energy, solar installation, community solar, and energy storage. And you could even think about if you've got, say, electric buses and you have a charging or a fleet charging place nearby, that could actually be like a backup battery for a cooling hub or a a cooling center or resilience hub if there's a power outage. So I'll just mention a couple of sort of broad strategies for thinking about planning for infrastructure investment. And, you know, we talk a lot about shovel-ready projects. Maybe you've heard people say shovel-ready isn't always shovel-worthy. So, you know, especially when there's a big piece of legislation like the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, there's a lot of money coming in relatively quickly, and the easiest thing for a community to do is to grab a plan that they already have developed that's sitting on the shelf and use that to apply for funding. But as one of our consultants like to say, there might be a reason that that plan is sitting on the shelf. It might not have been something that the community really wanted to implement. So the idea is to have good plans ready to go when you get that funding. And a great illustration of that is Edmonston, Maryland, which is a small town just outside the Washington, D.C. boundary. So they had troubles with localized flooding on their residential street. They got a grant from a Chesapeake Bay nonprofit to develop a design for a green and complete street. And then when they got funding from EPA to upgrade their wastewater infrastructure, they were able to use that design that they had. And so, sorry, my panel is blocking the view a little bit here, but so they have a bike lane, and you can't really see in the picture, but the bike lane is pervious pavement, so the water infiltrates instead of pooling. And then when they have water running along the curb here, it goes into this planted area through this curb cut, and then it gets captured, slowed, and infiltrated in this planted area. And then what's left is cleaner and a lower volume, and that's what goes into the storm sewer. So that's just a great illustration of the benefit of having a good plan. Whoops. So the three main strategies I want to talk about are looking for multiple benefits, considering climate change, and getting meaningful public involvement. So, you know, when you have to dig up a street, you might as well do as much as you can while you have that street dug up. If you're repairing water mains, or you have to repave it or something, if you can combine projects, you only have to dig once. So when you repave that street, you can put in a bike lane. You can add, you know, a rain garden like Edmonston did. And that also lets you find different funding sources for the same project. You just have to frame it a little bit differently. So my office several years ago helped Little Rock, Arkansas with a green street design, and they ended up being able to implement that by getting funding from the state for water infrastructure, but they also got an Our Town grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, because it was a community revitalization project as well. And you can, you know, I saw that a lot of you said your projects were incremental, and you can cobble together a lot of incremental funding. You know, I love these downspouts in Seattle. They have a whole system there where they have these beautiful artistic downspouts that direct stormwater out of the storm sewer. They gather it from the roof, it comes down through these downspouts. They have artistic cisterns also. It goes into a series of rain gardens along the street. It's really beautiful. It's essentially public art, and they used a grant from a foundation for public art to build that. So that's the kind of thing, it's little bits here and there, but you can put them all together to create something that's really beautiful. You know, it attracts people to the neighborhood to see these things. It creates a real sense of place. So as I was starting to put together this presentation, I happened to see this article on infrastructure coordinators, and I have the link to it in the handout that you should have available in your box there. But essentially, this article talked about how some cities are hiring infrastructure coordinators who coordinate projects across departments and then across other jurisdictions. And that can really help with that idea of finding different funding sources for the same project. But of course, not every community is going to be able to afford to hire one full-time person to do that. And so you can also accomplish the same goal by just having regular meetings of all the different departments to make sure that your plans are aligned, you're prioritizing, and you're looking for those opportunities to get multiple benefits. So, like I said, I work mostly on climate change. It sounds like you all have already had some exposure to climate change planning from some of the webinars that Carla mentioned. So I want to mention two things, you know, thinking about what climate conditions are projected to be throughout the lifespan. And, you know, really when we're talking about infrastructure, it's like beyond the lifespan. I mean, we've got, you know, water mains that are 100 years old in some places. So really thinking pretty far out about what the climate conditions are projected to be and using climate change scenarios as opposed to past trends, because past trends are no longer predictive of future conditions. So the changes you want to learn about are the projected changes in, you know, extreme highs and lows, average highs and lows, temperatures, changes in the frequency of intense storms, the amount of precipitation, flooding, drought can cause land subsidence, which can affect infrastructure, and then wildfires and sea level rise and the associated storm surge. So, you know, the temperature, flooding, and drought, that's really a little bit more about the type of materials you use. You have to use ones that are going to be appropriate for that climate. But the wildfire and sea level rise are more about location. And when the public sector invests money in a place, that's a really strong signal to the private sector about where they should be investing, because it shows a certain commitment. So think about where you want to encourage investment and development in your community. Presumably you have a comprehensive plan that has some areas designated for growth. So think about what are those areas that are well connected to existing development, but are also safer from these projected changes in the climate conditions. And then something that, you know, not a lot of people are talking about, I don't think, but it's very important to be thinking about this now. And it's just to think in general, what is your community's climate going to be like in, you know, whatever time frame you want to pick, 20 to 50 years. Is your community going to be less affected by climate change, or is it going to be more affected? Are people going to be coming to your community because they perceive it to be safer, or are they going to be moving away from your community because they can't deal with the heat, or they're tired of you know, having to rebuild after a flood or a wildfire? So especially if your community is perceived to be safer, it's important to start thinking now about how's that going to affect your projected population growth? How does that affect your infrastructure needs and your planning? And there's, you know, frankly, not a ton of resources out there on this, but it's important to start thinking about now. So as far as resources, you know, you probably have city or state experts or universities. The U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit has a great map that will show you where your regional climate hubs are from USDA and NOAA. And then a resource that EPA has nothing to do with, I just like it, is riskfactor.com. So that has property level data for projected flooding and wildfire. And it's meant for home buyers. I used it actually when I was shopping for a home about a year ago, and actually we decided not to put in an offer on a house because we saw that even though the house itself was not projected to experience flooding, the road that led to it was. So you can zoom out and look at it from a community level too. So meaningful public engagement. You know, I was glad to hear Carla say that there's a real focus on equity, and that's important. You know, there are people who have been historically left out of decision making, either because they don't know about the opportunities to give input or they don't feel welcome to give input. So it's important to make a particular effort to reach out to those groups, reach out to the people who are overburdened and underserved, and the ones who will be most affected by the infrastructure project. And don't expect them to find you. Don't expect, don't just put up a notice on your web page and call it a day. You really have to meet them where they are. Work with community-based organizations, find the people that they trust in the community to help engage them and help bring them to the table and get their input and share with them how their input is being used. And then, especially for overburdened and underserved populations, they're more vulnerable to many climate change impacts because they often have economic and health disparities. So you can help protect them with infrastructure investments. And not only that, but you can not just address, but also redress disparities. So consider that as well. So there's a ton of EPA resources. I'm getting close to my time, so I'm not going to run through all of these. These are all on the handout, so don't feel like you need to take notes or anything. I want to mention one thing. So these are grants and technical assistance, essentially, that can help with pre-development planning that can really be useful when you're talking about the type of funding that Seema and Robert will talk about. I'll call out a couple of things. One is the state revolving funds. Check with your state SRF to see if they will fund green infrastructure. Most of them will, I think. So that can be, again, another little bit of funding to put into a project. And I know our office worked many years ago with a couple of state revolving funds to also encourage them to prioritize compact development and infill. And then again, this is resources from my office. These are all on the handout, so please take a look at that. We developed these through our technical assistance projects that really helped us learn what communities need. And I'm going to talk a little bit about two of them. The first is this infrastructure financing options for TOD. That's a, fair warning, it's a huge document, but I think it has a pretty good index and table of contents to help you navigate. It has some really innovative models and strategies for financing TOD. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And then, because it's something that I spent a couple of years of my life on, the Smart Growth Fixes for Climate Adaptation and Resilience is specific land use and building code and policy changes that local governments can make to adapt to climate change while also getting environmental, economic, equity, and health benefits. So I'm going to just put up my contact information quickly. Feel free to reach out to me, and then I will turn it over to Seema now.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully it worked, the transition. Thank you, Megan.
Everything looks great.
Oh, great. I'm Seema Thomas. I'm the Deputy Director for the Financial Management Division, which oversees the Section 108 Loan Guarantee Program. Now, most of you may associate HUD with housing, which obviously we're very involved in, but we're also very much involved on the urban development side. And our program sits on the urban development side, what we internally call community planning and development. Now, through our program, we work with local governments, states, territories to finance a range of infrastructure projects with a focus on projects in underserved areas across the nation. This, of course, includes TOD projects as well. Megan did a great job setting the stage for thinking about federal opportunities in the planning and the design phase that's really needed, especially from an assessment visioning point of view. And this really helps communities understand their current state and what they want to do. HUD comes in for the next stage, and we play a critical role in the actual development of community infrastructure. And so we've been in this space for almost 50 years. We support everything from sidewalks to sanitation, basically anything in a community that will support its viability. So today I'll give a brief overview of HUD Section 108, but please know this is a first conversation of many, and we're always very happy to meet, to share, brainstorm together in the future. So here we have an infographic, and it just gives you a little bit of a historical perspective of our program. It started in the 1970s, and we are now approaching our milestone of 10 billion in total commitments. We have worked with over half of our eligible grantees, 630 communities across the US. And one important point to note is that through a study that was done by our research department, for every $1 of HUD Section 108 financing that was spent, communities were able to leverage an additional $5 in additional funding. So that's something to keep in mind. And it speaks to the point that Megan referenced earlier of sending a signal. When the public, when the federal government goes in and sends a signal like a loan guarantee, it's very much for others to start getting involved in that development process. So very briefly, what I thought I would do is just give a very brief overview of Section 108, explain a little bit how it can be combined with other resources, in particular since we're with other federal programs as well, and then share a very high-level quick overview of projects from our portfolio, just to give you a few ideas of what you could do and the possibilities that might exist, as well as some resources. So the Section 108 program is part of the Community Development Block Program, which we call CDBG at HUD. And many of you may know this, it also includes CDBG disaster recovery, CDBG mitigation as well. And our program is a loan component, and all of these programs use the chassis of the CDBG program. That gives an annual grant on a formula basis to states, cities, and counties across the United States. And really the idea is to support communities in providing decent housing in a suitable living environment, as well as thinking about economic opportunities. Last year, appropriation was about $3.5 billion, and we have about 1,260 grantees that are eligible for the grant. Now, the Section 108 program is not a grant, but it is a loan guarantee that leverages the CDBG program, the grants that come from there. It uses the same programmatic framework, so all the programmatic requirements that are applicable to CDBG are applicable to Section 108. However, it is non-competitive and it is very low cost financing. For most of the year, we were under 0.5% of late because of rising rates. It is now near 1.5%. Because the program is non-competitive, our staff can provide considerable one-on-one technical assistance at any stage of the project. So that's something to keep in mind as you work, as you might consider a 108 and try to understand the eligibility and requirements. Now, fundamental to the program and CDBG in general is that one national objective must be met. And here I have the 3 national objectives listed. The one we most commonly seen used is benefit to low and moderate income persons. The second one that we see most often used is related to the elimination of blight. And the third one, more rare, more used in the disaster recovery context, is for urgent need. And again, all projects must meet at least one of these national objectives. So although we are focused on infrastructure today, just wanted to highlight again the range, because sometimes there's intersections of other categories with TOD and sustainable infrastructure projects. So broadly, these are the 4 buckets: economic development, housing, public facilities, and infrastructure. But within those categories, there's a large range. It spans quite a bit what a community can do. And obviously it can support water and sanitation, streets, curbs, gutter improvements, and other types of important infrastructure projects that a community might have. We have more information at our regs at 570-703. Now, similar to the poll question, we're always very curious about that. Again, Section 108, it mirrors the needs of the community, so it can support the entire range, depending on the borrowing capacity of the community, but it can support incremental projects to something more transformative that could redevelop an entire neighborhood. And to give you a monetary sense of what that looks like, we have done a loan guarantee for as small as $30,000, and then a loan guarantee on the magnitude of hundreds of millions. So there's a very wide range. This year alone, we did a loan guarantee for Ana Cortez in the state of Washington for about $153,000. And then we did a much larger loan guarantee for Washington, DC, about around 80 million in total financing. So now thinking about who has access to the funds. So as part of the CDBG family, the funds go directly to the entities at the city level, county level, or states that manage the CDBG program. And this tends to be the Housing and Community Development Department, sometimes Economic Development Department. However, there are many other mechanisms to access the Section 108. It can be a range of partnerships with nonprofits, third-party developers, other smaller units of government, and other parts of local government can get involved as a designated public agency as well. The key thing is to talk to us early so we can help iron out the details and help finalize the arrangement that would best work for the project. So here we wanted to highlight two approaches that we've seen used for Section 108 financing. One of them is project specific, and this is where you have a high degree of specificity for the project. You know all the details, where it's going, who the partners are in the project, and you would submit an application with those details. But sometimes for a community, there's less information. It's a little bit more generalized, but you might have a pipeline of proposed projects, and that is also acceptable. We work closely with the community, and we would work very closely with our local field office, of which we have 43, in determining how each one would work within that. And this gives a lot of flexibility to communities. It allows them to diversify as well, and there are a lot of benefits. So both approaches can be used. It's just a matter of connecting with us to identify what might work best for a community. And then speaking to borrowing capacity, and I can put this in the chat a little bit later, but basically a community would take their annual CDBG allocation, multiply it by 5, and then they would subtract out any commitments or loans that they may have. And here you can see an example. This is only for illustration. There's a big range. We have very small communities to very large communities, and so the borrowing capacity reflects that as well. So there are lots of advantages to using Section 108, its loan guarantee program. Again, it can be used for a wide range of uses. It's extremely flexible. There's considerable TA. For local governments, an aspect that might be of interest is that it does not count towards the local debt ceiling. And again, it's rolling applications, so there is no deadline. It can come in pretty much every day of the year, except the days, obviously, that we're closed. And there's an immediate availability of funds since we access the private markets. Now, this section just wanted to highlight here how 108 is paired with other sources of financing. So oftentimes we see it standalone, and this we see for more smaller scale, large physical development projects, and where communities are seeking to amortize across a longer timeline. So it might have a very high upfront cost, and they want to split that cost over 20 years. The other scenario, the second scenario where we see it, is under combined, and this is layered with other types of federal, state, local financing. And then the third scenario where we see Section 108 is under gap financing. And so when we see this scenario, it's oftentimes where a community is trying to move forward with a project, and they just need that little bit of money to move it past its pinch point to close the deal and finalize it. We also have seen Section 108 as something like seed funding, where it's sending a signal for others to come in, and we're sending a signal of public investment for others to come in as well too. So there are multiple ways that it might fit into what we call the financial or the capital stack, and it's important for communities to think about the role that they would want the financing to play. And then just very briefly here, it can be combined with many other types of federal financing. We've seen our funding combined with EPA's different programs, DOTs, but then there are also a range of other financing such as historic tax credits, and of course those on the housing and economic development side. So this perhaps is my favorite part of the presentation. This is where I get to share a little bit more about the projects that we have in our portfolio. It's not an exhaustive list by any stretch, but I just wanted to illustrate the different possibilities that could exist with the financing. So Megan covered quite a bit on the planning stages as well. Some of the financing can be used for preparation and pre-development, but also funds can be used for implementation as well. So it's something to keep in mind as you think about Section 108. So this project comes out of Los Angeles. This is a LEED Gold certified project, And it is a TOD site that located 1 block away from a large transportation hub in the San Fernando Valley. Here, the city used the Section 108 funds for pre-development financing and even some construction costs. And the building site itself has a large parking structure, office space, as well as an art house and theater. But it was a great example of adaptive reuse and mixed use. Another TOD project we wanted to highlight, also in California, is in Sacramento. This was a community that was located on 20+ acres, a residential community, and it was disconnected from downtown Sacramento. So the city came in, sought a Section 108, and they wanted to increase connectivity. They started initial phase of TOD. They put a light rail system in there to connect it better to downtown. And in particular, if you can see on the map, the community was blocked at a certain point by train tracks, levees, and rivers. Shifting gears to a smaller town, this is in Beaver County, a community northwest of Pittsburgh. The county took out a Section 108 for much smaller scale projects in 2 of their small towns. And really the goal of these 2 projects was to improve community transportation. And again, this is probably what we would put on the scale of incremental. And it was really also a way to encourage more development because part of this area had been covered by brownfields as well. So one of the projects, it revitalized its main street downtown. It improved sidewalks, added some rights of way, planting street trees, installing benches. And then the second community, they made quite a few updates and changes to improve safety and accessibility in compliance with ADA. Here's a slightly larger scale project out of Denison, Texas. Here the community commissioned a study on the quality and the state of their roads, and they found that they were considered to be a fair condition. So they sought a Section 108 to help with the upfront cost so they could do an accelerated timeline of removing and replacing the top layer of asphalt on their roads. And because we are talking about sustainable infrastructure, wanted to just shift gears and talk briefly about water projects, especially because some of these sites will have different types of public infrastructure, public works that might be important to consider. This is a community in Florida, Brevard County, and from a study, they had learned that a subset of their homes had exceeded the arsenic and lead levels that was acceptable. So they wanted to build a potable water line. In this case, it was 12 inches. And during that process, they also added in a layer of public safety and protection by adding in fire hydrants in the process. This is another project in Meriden, Connecticut. What is exciting about this project is that they combined 3 community goals. One was to address remediation. The second one was to think about flood control infrastructure because this community had experienced significant flooding. And the third one was to think about park space in an area that had been underserved and didn't have adequate park space. So this community, they had these silver factories. They used the Section 108 funds to help with demolition and installation of some of the flood control infrastructure. This was also a project that combined with EPA funds as well. And then last, wanted to share that this is a commitment that we had given to a community in Merced, California. And this is thinking about sustainable energy infrastructure. In this case, the community, they use the funds, or they're going to use the funds to build a solar panel canopy above their parking structure, their parking lot. And they're also using the funds for electric vehicle charging stations as well. So here, just wanted to highlight some resources. We have almost everything one could want to learn about our program on HUD Exchange, and that is the go-to website for HUD in general, for all HUD programs. Here I wanted to highlight our mailing list. Feel free to jump on it. We try to share resources from our program, but also other federal programs and community partners. And we have many other resources available on HUD Exchange. Also wanted to highlight that we are willing to provide considerable technical assistance as needed through each stage of the project. So keep that in mind as you're thinking through and working through some of the details. And finally, here is my contact information. Please don't hesitate to contact me. And I just wanted to emphasize again that our program can support transit-oriented development, other sustainability projects. So while we can support those projects, DOT's projects can cover the full range of needs in the sector in terms of time, scale, scope, et cetera. So with that, I will now pass to Robert.
Thanks, Seema. Share my screen. Slight delay and oh, there we go. Can you see my presentation mode?
Yep, looks good. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thanks. Sorry all for the slight pause. Well, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be here with my fellow federal panelists. My name is Robert Hanniff, and I'm a project development lead at the Build America Bureau. I focus specifically on the transit and transit-oriented development portfolio. My background is in planning, urban planner. I actually joined the APA when I was like 18 or 19. I was that eager, and have been basically a member ever since. And so my background has been mostly in TOD and joint development and transportation. So really looking forward to kind of going over the TOD and sustainable infrastructure, specifically transportation investments that DOT can provide, as well specifically as my organization, the Build America Bureau. So the Bureau itself is actually a pretty young, new organization. It was set up about 6 years ago, and it was created by the FAST Act, basically to consolidate loan programs and more broadly technical assistance just into one house, right? So originally FHWA was in charge of our TIFIA loan program, FRA was in charge of our RIF loan program, and then technical assistance is really spread throughout the modes. Obviously the modes still provide that technical assistance, but we're really created as this one-stop shop. So we administer these two loan programs, TIFIA and RIF. We also allocate private activity bonds. And then we have this whole technical assistance mission. And that does include 3, specifically technical assistance grant programs in which we provide grants to prospective borrowers or folks just, interested in exploring different financing opportunities. We can provide grants for you all to do that kind of pre-planning, pre-development planning, early studies, bring in advisors of your own. And then, like I said, we provide technical assistance directly. We have a team, and we've been building up a team recently to do that. So that's kind of our mission, financing, innovative funding, solutions, and then technical assistance. We sit within the office of the secretary, and so we have a credit office, and again, they do a lot of the financing side, these loan programs specifically. And then we have an outreach and project development team, which includes myself. Like I said, I'm a project development lead. I focus on transit and TOD. We have folks that focus on different types of surface transportation. And then we have a technical assistance team. We work with basically all the modes now because of the infrastructure law. Now we will be working with FAA on surface transportation projects. So I work very closely with FTA and FRA specifically, but also occasionally FHWA and other modes, simply because many projects are multimodal in nature. And so we work with the different regions or field offices, the different grant programs. When folks are exploring different financing opportunities, they often will come to us, and we can either, provide answers related to our programs or point them in the right direction, or just bring together all these resources within DOT into the same conversation and room and kind of brainstorm that further. DOT is a very large organization, and so I fully understand that it's hard to navigate all the different programs and departments and agencies and all the opportunities out there. So we're kind of here to provide that kind of one-stop shop resource. So transit-oriented development. I'm using these 3 terms because they relate to our programs: surface transportation, public infrastructure, and economic development. So TOD is more than just private vertical development, right? You need a T, you need transit, whether that's, rail or other types of fixed guideway transit facilities, or bus, bus TOD, even if it's not fixed guideway. So surface transportation is key. Good surface transportation, non-polluting, preferably surface transportation. Public infrastructure. There's a lot that goes into building a community that's not just private development, commercial, residential, or a train station, right? There's parks, there's civic spaces, and so that's one of our eligible uses actually under our program. And then economic development is basically a provision within our own loan programs that allows us to finance vertical private development. So it's worth noting, noting that obviously T is critical to TOD, but so is all other forms of surface transportation, right? How do people get to the actual passenger facility itself? Like they need to walk there or bike there, or they need ADA accessibility. There's more to transit-oriented development, building out transit-oriented communities than just, investing in transit itself. And so our programs offer really broad eligibilities in terms of surface transportation, but also this public infrastructure provision and economic development provisions that focus on both the horizontal and vertical development. Why is the Department of Transportation involved in TOD? Because TOD ultimately supports transit. It supports communities, healthy communities, sustainable communities. It gives people options in where to live. It gives them access to affordable, safe, reliable, ideally transit, right? And it's so critical. I mean, I think we're all seeing in this day and age with high gas prices, right? I mean, some people are definitely, feeling it more than others, and transit has actually really stepped in many ways to continue to provide people with access, and mobility to jobs and housing and public services at affordable costs. So our programs, TIPI and RIF, are the two main loan programs. They've been around for about 2 decades now. Similar to the Section 108 program. So these are loans. They're not grants, right? And everybody always wants a grant. But it's worth recognizing that the federal government doesn't give, typically for most programs, doesn't do 100% funding of a project, right? A federalized project. There needs to be some type of local commitment or local share. And often that could be upfront contributions, but many communities don't have $10 million to drop on a project up front. They have to save for it. But the other alternative is that they finance it. And sometimes that means they're doing municipal bonds. But these are just additional tools offered by DOT to finance transportation projects as well as TOD projects. So we have $100 billion in lending capacity between these two programs. That basically means that, because it does pop up, even when you try to force teams not to. So, we have $100 billion in lending capacity. These are loan programs. You pay them back. They're non-competitive, right? Unlike grant programs, which are extremely oversubscribed, very competitive. Basically, if you meet the statutory criteria, you are an eligible borrower, you have an eligible project, you can demonstrate that it's a credit-worthy repayment source. You're able to repay the loan, we can basically finance your project. There are certain, trade-offs and benefits to our loan programs. One is a long-term repayment period. Thanks to the infrastructure law, we can actually do loans technically up to 75 years for long life assets. It's actually based on the useful life of the asset. So if you're doing say bus acquisition or fleet transition, you get 15 years, right? That is 12 years. That's the useful life of a bus. But maybe it'll be increased to 15 to 18 with electric vehicles and new technology. So it's linked to the life of the asset. We basically offer the treasury rate, again, based on the corresponding treasury security of similar maturity, which means if you are getting a 30-year TIPI or RIF loan, you're going to basically get the treasury rate, the 30-year treasury rate, which today was like about 3.2%. There's no prepayment penalty. You can defer repayment of principal and interest up to 5 years following substantial completion. And then we offer direct loans as well as loan guarantees and lines of credit. So in many ways, there's similar but different and kind of corresponding financing tools to what EPA and HUD can offer. Obviously, we have much of a transportation focus. My slides are a bit delayed. Okay. Really key program requirements. So there are strings attached to getting federal dollars, right? Federal requirements apply. I'm talking NEPA, Buy America. There are others, Title VI Civil Rights, URA, Uniform Relocation Act. So those are the strings attached to using federal programs. Under TIPIA, there is a threshold, $10 million minimum project cost, which I know is a high bar. But there is actually a lot of flexibility to bundle different types of projects that aren't even necessarily physically functionally related to each other. Really part of the kind of intake process and reviewing these opportunities and kind of engaging the Bureau and DOT is figuring out like, well, what is the scope of this project? What are the different elements? Is it just a transit project? Are there other adjacent areas that you're trying to group in? Oftentimes, actually, just for transit capital projects that FTA can fund, you know, the facility or the scope of the project isn't just limited to a platform and an entrance to a station or a bus stop, right? There's, you know, multimodal ped bike kind of infrastructure. There's parking. There's plazas. You know, there's different ways to think creatively about how you can bundle different projects. The caveat is that they need to be from the same repayment source. So you can do TOD plus other types of surface transportation, and that can be bundled. That $10 million threshold is only for TIFIA, not for RIF, and RIF is railroad focused. For TIFIA, to apply, you need an investment grade rating from a national ratings agency. That is because we subsidize the credit risk on a TIFIA loan. We do not do the same for RIF. Well, actually, the infrastructure law did change that a little bit, which we're working through, but half of that subsidy is actually dedicated to railroads. So, you know, these projects need to be in the transportation planning and programming cycle, you know, TIP, STIP, Metropolitan or Regional Transportation Plan, and you need to pledge a dedicated and secured revenue source. You know, in terms of eligible activities, we have development phase activities, planning, feasibility studies, environmental permitting, kind of preliminary construction work and design, as well as the construction itself, land acquisition, capitalized interest. Just a list, it's pretty wide spectrum. It's important to note that all of the costs within the loan, within scoping out this project, they need to have met federal requirements, right? That includes, you know, procurement, like full and open competition. If you were to do environmental review, you can include previously incurred costs in the sizing of the loan. And we can technically actually close on the loan up to 1 year following substantial completion of the project, which is basically like opening it to revenue service or to occupancy, say. So to date, we have done many surface transportation projects. Our transit portfolio, again, focusing on the T of TOD, it's critical to have that in terms of this holistic corridor planning, good transit that, as far as the Bureau loan programs are concerned, meet these different thresholds or qualifying features. So on the transit side, we've done about $16 billion in TIFIA and RIF financing for transit projects across the country to date. These programs have been around for about 2 decades. I think there's a few misconceptions about the types of projects we do. We have done a lot of very major, like, you know, 1 billion plus, you know, infrastructure, transit, subway projects. Our smallest project actually to date was only 17 million, and the loan itself was 8 million. So it's just a huge range. And for projects that are under 75 million in cost, we can waive or reduce certain borrower fees. And for rural projects, which our definition of rural is actually different. Unfortunately, the DOT and the federal government tend to have varying definitions of rural. For us, it's outside of a urban area with a population greater than 150,000. So basically urban areas with 150,000 or more people are not rural. Everything else is rural, which you know, acknowledging that that's a different definition than FTA would have for transit. We can actually offer up to 49% for TIFIA and at half that interest rate. So that would be what, 1.56% today, which is really more competitive than anything else you're going to find at, say, in terms of municipal bonds or private financing. We've, you know, done pretty transformative projects to date. I think really all of these projects, frankly, are pretty transformative for their respective communities. In terms of scale, though, you know, we're helping build out, basically finance the build out of the Link light rail system in Seattle. You know, Moynihan was another project, Denver Union Station. We've done a number of bus O&M facilities in rural California, all very transformative to their respective communities. So thinking about just sustainable infrastructure investment and not, you know, the communities, but also the actual infrastructure and kind of transportation investment priorities. It's important to recognize that what I think 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions comes from the transportation industry. So addressing that is so critical to advancing and sustainability goals and creating sustainable communities. Part of that is, yes, mode shift over to transit, and out of single occupancy vehicles and, electrifying different types of fleets, whether it's private vehicles or bus fleets or ferries, right? So interestingly, the Bureau can basically finance any project that FTA or FHWA can fund under their programs, except for operations and maintenance, like the actual activities of operations and maintenance. It's important to note that. We can do O&M facilities, the capital projects. So anything FTA and FHWA can fund under their programs is eligible for TIFIA financing. And so that's the spectrum of facilities and equipment and infrastructure and systems that can actually advance towards fleet electrification, right? And I think that's so critical to know in terms of just sustainable communities, and also just making sure that communities which have been disproportionately impacted by the negative impacts of transportation, air pollution, et cetera, that we see those as opportunities, right? Opportunities to make those transportation systems and facilities better neighbors that don't pollute, these neighborhoods, because disproportionately those uses, these heavier industrial uses are in, neighborhoods that historically have not had a voice, right? And so it's just a really interesting opportunity to think really holistically about how are we going to use transportation funding and financing, especially with the infrastructure law. How are we going to pull together all these different local, state, federal resources to really fix our transportation system so they're not having the same negative impact, or at least mitigating future impacts. And so it's not just about investing in transit, it's about also investing in TOD, but also, this project on the bottom right here is actually a multimodal street network project that the city of Bellevue actually did, that was actually a highway project, but, under FHWA, not a highway project, but I'd say road network project that was really in anticipation of the Eastlink light rail extension. They were basically doing a retrofitting suburbia kind of, let's put in a street grid and make this a walkable community and make sure that people can actually get to the station once it arrives. And I think that's really critical too, right? Again, it's not just about transit investments, it's about all the transportation network. So this is probably worth a series on its own, so I'm not going to go over this in too much detail. Worth noting, I'll just say, because I focus on transit, on the transit and rail side, there's probably about over $200 billion. So completely transformational, a lot of federal money coming in on multiple fronts. But it's also really important to realize that the federal government is going to pay for everything, right? And in fact, just looking at kind of this capital stack, this financial structure, most of our projects actually that are funded and financed by DOT, many of them have a significant local financial commitment. So if you're looking at this chart on the left, basically the federal grant side, which is what the bipartisan infrastructure law will represent, the federal share of that, there's going to be more money for that, but ultimately at the project level, that federal share is not as large as most people think. And that's both because programs limit the max federal share. And also, honestly, these are very competitive grant programs. And so in order to compete, a lot of folks don't request the maximum amount. So I think it's really imperative that folks start to think about, well, what is the state and local level going to do, right, to be competitive for these grant programs? So one of those tools, the tools that we presented today are, one opportunity for you all to leverage local funds. In addition to state local funds that are just upfront payments, contributions, maybe even on the private side as well. TIFIA and RIF are not considered federal funds. It's not part of the federal share if they're repaid with local and state, resources, non-federal resources. And that's really critical because, again, there are caps on federal share for multiple grant programs. Our loans, TIFIA RIF, can support and provide complementary financing, last-in financing, gap financing for a number of transportation projects. Gonna speed up to make sure we talk about TOD more, but again, I wanted to really focus on the T part. So public infrastructure. This is a pretty broad eligibility under TIFIA. Basically anything within a half mile of a certain type of qualifying station. So a fixed guideway transit facility, that could be BRT, it could be ferry, it could be aerial gondola. It could be rail stations, anything within a half mile of that, that's public infrastructure. And that could be both horizontal as well as vertical buildings that have public or civic purposes, that is eligible for TIPIA. Okay. And then economic development. There is a criteria, and this is actually thanks to the infrastructure law. Some of this language was added to TIPIA, and it's now under RIF as well. So basically, we can finance economic development, which I think most folks would associate more with like typical TOD, like kind of private or nonprofit vertical development. We can finance economic development up to 75% around eligible rail stations. There is a private investment component. Again, the type of qualifying station is more limited for this kind of eligibility or authority, and that has to be around a rail station. And then also the non-federal match. So for TIPIA it has to be 20%, but the non-federal match for RIF has to be 25%. Wrapping up here, I just wanted to point out we have TOD guidance FAQs online. DOT also has FTA has a pilot program for TOD planning. I believe the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, is out right now. I can't quote the actual date that the applications are due, but I highly recommend that you look into that. It's kind of, an opportunity to do some corridor planning in anticipation of, corridor transit investments. And again, the Bureau has 3 technical assistance opportunities that are really meant to help folks explore different financing opportunities. There is more of a transportation focus to those technical assistance programs, but that just really is an opportunity to think creatively about the projects that you're trying to deliver. We've seen in our own pipeline that folks, especially small towns and rural areas, they don't have the capacity to do like one large, a new library and then one transit facility and then a new civic building. In many cases, this is a once in a lifetime, once in a generation investment in a public building. And so they'll be combining these things. Like they try to strategically combine civic uses and transportation uses, and, things like that, kind of creative blending of transportation and non-transportation projects is something that may be eligible for the different technical assistance grant programs. So with that, I will turn it back and stop sharing. Sorry that my Teams popped up. Not even on, so I don't know how that happened.
All right. Thank you. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box. We'll see how many of these we can get to. The first one, it's actually going to be for you, Robert. There's a couple questions clarifying what RIF funds can be used for. The first question is streetcar systems.
I want to know who asked this.
I'm not ready to say.
This is a great question. Okay, so there's a backstory to this. So historically, RIF could only finance intercity passenger rail, freight rail, and commuter rail. And by extension, TOD was only allowed to be around those stations. But the bipartisan infrastructure law had this, Congress basically included this new definition or reference to a definition of rail, which is not just railroad, it's also rail carrier, in a way to basically try to open up that eligibility to all different types of rail under RIF. And so this is, and I've been telling folks this for a few months longer than I wanted to, that we're still doing our kind of legal analysis and policy development around RIF. Candidly, I don't know another way to interpret it other than opening it up to other forms of RIF. Like, what would be the purpose of adding in the language if to keep everything the same? But Congress gave us an interesting one to figure it out. I'll say that. We're looking to figure this out soon, in the coming months. It's, time.
Okay. And then the second clarification on RIF funds, a municipality has an interest in converting a segment of no longer used rail spur line into a dedicated way for BRT. Can RIF funds be used for this type of project?
Well, the construction project is not a rail project, so I would say no. As far as the acquisition, that is a gray area, and it might be possible, right? It's for acquisition of rail facilities, obviously with the intent of keeping the rail facilities. So I would say it's more unlikely than likely, but yeah, definitely on the construction project, I don't think that's going to happen. It has to be a railroad project.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Seema, you're up next. the Section 108 loans for urban counties. Are there complications where an entire urban county is made up of member cities, villages, and townships, and there are no areas in the urban county where the county government is the local government, i.e. states with townships and towns? In our urban county, each member jurisdiction has an annual allocation of CDBG funds, and the county itself does not receive specific set-aside funding. So is this a problem with paying down Section 108 loans?
Yeah, so each state is different in how their jurisdictions are outlined. So as an example, in Pennsylvania, what sometimes they'll do, they'll receive state funds, and then that'll trickle down to the different townships. They have their own formula that they apply based on a variety of factors. So what I would say is, if there's interest in projects, just come and talk to us early, because there might be a couple of different ways that could be configured. Sometimes what we'll see communities do, they'll figure out an ideal pass-through mechanism in order to do that if they can get from the state level, and then they'll try to coordinate their efforts if it's a broader countywide effort with the local jurisdiction. It's hard to speak just generally and to get to the specifics, but there are ways, and we can work in rural areas. It's just a different process.
Thank you. Megan, are your agency's funding programs making any changes to encourage applicants to consider climate change impacts?
Sure. So all federal agencies had to create a climate adaptation action plan, and those are all posted online. You can find them just by Googling. And as part of our plan at EPA, we committed to integrating climate adaptation into all of our funding mechanisms. So that means, any kinds of loans or grants. In my office, we're also taking it to mean the contracting that we do to bring in consultants for our technical assistance. So we're still working out exactly how that's going to, the exact language and exactly what's going to be affected and how. That'll all be posted publicly, I believe, by September of this year. I know that, we are just thinking about, we do some projects that are completely about climate adaptation, but we do others where we really need to be considering climate change more in the project. And so we'll have language that helps do that. I think some of the funding programs will have language that will say explicitly, you can use some of this funding to do a climate vulnerability assessment or something like that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, Robert, this one here is for you. What type of projects are becoming increasingly popular? Any interesting industry trends?
So I assume this is just TOD, because obviously I'll say the transit portfolio is unreal at this point. There's so much interest in transit, like within my organization, but FTA obviously in their grant program. So TOD specifically, I'm seeing a lot of like in our pipeline, a lot of civic projects, and from an important thing to remember in terms of applying to our programs, yes, there needs to be an eligible borrower and there needs to be an eligible project, but really on the creditworthiness standpoint, that's, our programs are, because we offer such good rates and provisions, we kind of have high standards. I think those are kind of the projects that have a lot of like legs to them, both from like a public support and sponsorship, but also just on the credit side. So it's kind of a mix of civic projects and or mixed use projects for which there's a public partner who's very involved.
So to that, can the private sector or like a public-private partnership take advantage of these programs?
Yes. So under TIFIA, actually, so TIFIA has really broad eligibility. I think I mentioned it can do all surface transportation. And then as far as eligible borrowers, basically anyone public or private is eligible for a TIFIA loan. However, if it's a private entity, there has to be a public sponsor to that project. And then on the RIF side, it's a little bit different in that a private entity can be eligible, but it has to be in a joint venture with a public entity or a railroad. So there has to be some type of agreement. We're not really prescriptive about it. It doesn't mean that the public entity actually has to be on the loan. They're not a financial obligor, but they basically have to attest to the fact that, they're in this partnership to deliver a project. There's mutual benefits and contributions, et cetera. So there are requirements, and honestly, that's kind of a guardrail to the programs to ensure that the public is being heard, right?
This question, I guess, can go to anyone. And it's come up, I think, like 2 or 3 times now. Can we layer the different agency funding sources? And if so, where do we begin? Where do we start? Do we have to let everyone know that we're doing things with the other agencies? How does all that work if we want to try to layer funding to get as much impact as we can?
So absolutely, in terms of HUD Section 108, it can be layered with other sources of financing. I would urge, if that is going to happen, just to talk to us early so we can work out some of the details, iron out the details. Our funding can be used for a match if it's permitted. So other federal agencies sometimes do not permit it, but more than welcome to as well. And so figuring out some of those details to optimize the deal, the earlier you start the conversation, the better.
Okay. I believe Robert started to kind of get into this, what some of like the preferred kind of projects are that, the gold standard, I guess, of projects. To what extent are your agencies trying to shape funding requirements so that projects can tackle various issues like economic development, transportation, environmental quality, climate resilience, sustainability, equity, all the things? For example, if there's a project that is primarily funding a green infrastructure project on a street to help with flood risk, how much are sponsors encouraged to think about modifying the street to improve pedestrian bicycle safety at the same time? So is there, a certain level of kind of hand-holding or massaging, in terms of potentially shaping how a project turns out?
So I know that in the technical assistance projects my office has done, we definitely do that. And again, that's part of, kind of bringing in different funding sources by just recasting the project a different way. And I know that at one point, EPA's Office of Water Green Infrastructure Program was just saying basically a green street is a complete street. So in other words, if it's a green street, it does have bike and pedestrian amenities, or otherwise it's not green. So I think that there's strong support for it. In terms of like the specifics in different programs, I'm not sure what they have, but that's another thing that you can, think about trying to find a little bit of transportation funding to supplement the water infrastructure funding or something like that if we need to.
By the nature of programs in the CDBG family, it's slightly different. It may differ from the other federal programs in that a lot of the decision making and the overall community strategy is left to the community, and they have sort of that full latitude discretion to do it. That being said, there are a lot of toolkits, resources, I'm sure at all agencies to help inform them, but broadly they take the lead on, and it's really, the idea is they get the funds to do what they want to do within bounds.
Can any of these programs also include public art into the projects? Am I seeing yeses? Robert, are you thinking?
Yeah. Actually, I think I'm trying to think of like the statute under Chapter 53 Transit Capital Project. It's possible that art can be included. I'm sure there's a circular on this one topic, and it's probably 40 pages. So I imagine to some extent it can be, but I don't want to promise anything on that.
You're not held to it. Disclosure. Okay.
Disclosure, I don't work at FTA, so.
All right, so you've each highlighted the benefits of your programs. What are some of the challenges and trade-offs?
I'll say just
okay.
just what we have heard from a lot of local governments is it's a challenge to figure out what's available, to have the resources to put together an application. You have to do a different application for all these different federal programs, and then some of them, the grants management requirements can be pretty burdensome, and so that's, we have been hearing that for a long time, and we're trying to work on that.
Robert, Seema, go ahead, Robert.
Sure, I'll chime in. Yeah, so really the trade-offs are that, by getting a federal loan, you're federalizing the project, and there's just a lot of strings attached. I briefly mentioned it, right? NEVA, Buy America, Davis-Bacon prevailing wages, there's various reporting requirements. That's really challenging to navigate for folks who have never done a TIPIA or RIF loan, right? And it's reporting requirements over the length of the loan, right? There's certain requirements, and that can be daunting, understandably. So I think it's really critical that each applicant has a good team, whether they need to bring in financial or legal advisors or other kind of advisors. And again, I'll just mention, right, we have our technical assistance programs to hopefully help folks with that, at least at the beginning, to kind of build that capacity in-house. First, it's just outside consultants, but to be able to access these programs over the long term.
Yeah, and I would piggyback off of what Robert said. I think the federal cross-cutting requirements are something to consider because it adds layers of complexity to the project that one has to learn how to navigate or figure out. And specific to our program, one of the harder parts for communities, they have to pledge their CDBG funds as primary collateral for the loan, and that can be a tough choice to make because those CDBG funds are used for very important projects in other cases. So there's a cost benefit that needs to be considered.
Okay, it's time to wrap up. This has been fun, and we still have more questions. Thanks to all of our panelists today for joining us, and the cross collaboration of divisions of APA who put this series together. Couple reminders, we are recording the session. It's available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. Don't forget to log your CM credits. This session is available on demand through the end of the year, so you can view and log your credits at your leisure. 1.5 regular CM credits, one of the specialized sustainability and resiliency credits are both available for whichever ones you need. We will also have the supplemental handouts, which are in your GoToWebinar tool panel. We'll also have them available along with PDF copies of the slide decks on our website, which is also where you can go to register for all of our upcoming sessions, which are of course free of charge, and that is at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Thanks to all of you again for joining us today. Everyone have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.